This is Criminal Interrupted, and today we're confronting one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, Ed Gein. You've probably heard his name. Maybe you've seen the movies Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, even the most recent Netflix show, Monsters. But behind the horror icon is a real story of missing women and a community left to grieve in silence. This episode isn't about glorifying Gein, it's about reclaiming the narrative. We'll look at how his crimes were discovered, how the media turned him into a monster, and how the victims, Mary Hogan, Bernice Warden, and others, were overshadowed by spectacle. Because when true crime becomes pop culture, we risk forgetting the truth. And the truth is, real people were lost, real families were broken, and real justice was interrupted. Plainville, Wisconsin, a town of fewer than 700 people, surrounded by farmland and silence. It's here, in the isolation of a weathered farmhouse on the edge of town, that Edward Theodore Gein was raised, and where the seeds of one of America's most disturbing criminal legacies quietly took root. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, to George and Augusta Gein. He was the second of two sons. His older brother Henry was born 5 years earlier. From the beginning, Ed's world was shaped by emotional volatility and rigid control. His father, George, was a violent alcoholic who struggled to hold down work. He drifted between jobs as a carpenter, tanner, and briefly a grocery store owner, but his drinking and temper made stability impossible. Augusta, Ed's mother, was the dominant force in the household. A devout Lutheran, she believed the world outside their home was steeped in sin, especially sexual sin. She preached daily to her sons, often quoting scripture about divine punishment and moral decay. Her worldview was stark. Women were corrupting, men were weak, and salvation came only through obedience and isolation. Augusta reserved particular scorn for women she deemed promiscuous, and she instilled in Ed a deep fear of sexuality and moral failure. In 1915, when Ed was 9, the family moved to Plainville and purchased a 155-acre farm. The move wasn't just practical, it was strategic. Augusta wanted to isolate her family from what she saw as the corrupting influence of society. The farmhouse was remote, surrounded by woods and fields, and far from neighbours. Ed and Henry were discouraged from making friends, and social interactions was tightly controlled. At school, Ed was quiet and withdrawn. Teachers described him as shy, with strange mannerisms and a tendency to laugh at inappropriate moments. He struggled academically, but showed interest in reading, particularly adventure stories and later, autonomy and medical texts. He was often bullied for his odd behaviour and poor hygiene, and he rarely fought back. His emotional development was stunted by the lack of nurturing relationships and the constant reinforcement of fear and shame. Inside the home, Augusta's control was absolute. She censored books, forbade dating, and punished any signs of independence. Ed's attachment to her deepened in dependency. He saw her not as a mother, but as a moral compass, a protector, and the only person who truly understood him. This bond would later become central to his psychological unraveling. As Ed entered adolescence and early adulthood, the family dynamic remained rigid. George's alcoholism worsened, and he died in 1940 from heart failure. With their father gone, Ed and Henry took over the farm's operations, but tensions grew. Henry began dating and openly criticized Augusta's worldview. He worried about Ed's emotional immaturity and his obsessive devotion to their mother. In May 1944, tragedy struck. While burning brush on the property, a fire broke out. Ed reported Henry as missing and later led police directly to his body. Though the death was ruled as accidental, with the cause being asphyxiation, some investigators noted bruises on Henry's head. No charges were filed, but the circumstances remained suspicious. Whether or not Ed was involved, the result was still the same. He was now alone with Augusta. Later that year, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed became her full-time caretaker, tending to her every need. She recovered briefly, but a second stroke in December 1945 proved fatal. Her death devastated Ed. He described it as the moment his world ended. He boarded up the room she had used, preserving them as shrines. The rest of the house fell into disrepair. Ed retreated inward, living in a small corner of the farmhouse, surrounded by clutter, decay, and the remnants of a life that had stopped moving. This was the beginning of Ed Gein's true isolation, not just physical, but psychological. He stopped farming. He took odd jobs around town, handyman work, snow removal, even babysitting. Locals described him as strange but polite. He was soft-spoken, deferential, and always alone. He became known for his peculiar sense of humor and his fascination with morbid topics, but few saw him as dangerous. Inside the farmhouse, Ed's emotional world remained frozen in time. He kept Augusta's Bible, her furniture, and her clothing untouched. He spoke about her often, sometimes even in the present tense. His identity was still tethered to hers, and without her, he drifted. The isolation deepened, and the boundaries between memory, fantasy, and reality began to blur. It's important to understand that Ed Gein's early life was not marked by overt violence or criminal behavior. It was marked by emotional deprivation, psychological control, and profound loneliness. The conditions of his upbringing, rigid moralism, social isolation, and unresolved grief, created a fragile foundation. And while not every child raised in such circumstances become violent, in Ed's case, the damage was cumulative. And this is by no means any excuse for his later behavior. The farmhouse became a symbol of that damage. It was not just a place, it was a psychological landscape. A space where time stood still, where grief was preserved, and where identity began to fracture. Long before any crimes were committed, Ed Gein was already living in a world shaped by silence, fear, and the ghost of a mother who never truly left. After Augusta Gein's death in 1945, Ed Gein was left alone in the farmhouse that had once been ruled by her rigid moralism. Her absence was not liberating, it was destabilizing. In the years that followed, Ed's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Ed began reading obsessively, crime magazines, autonomy books, and medical texts. He became fascinated with human dissection and the female body. His grief over Augusta's death transformed into a fixation on recreating her presence. He later told authorities that he wanted to become his mother, and that he had considered creating a woman's suit from human skin to do so. This obsession led him to the local cemeteries. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed Gein made dozens of nocturnal visits to nearby graveyards. He later admitted to exhuming bodies from at least 9 graves, though he claimed he made as many as 40 attempts. He targeted recently buried middle-aged women who resembled Augusta. He worked quickly, often returning the same night the graves were filled. In some cases, he took entire bodies. In others, he removed specific parts: heads, genitals, skin. Inside his home, Gein used these remains to create grotesque artifacts. Investigators would later find bowls made from skulls, a lampshade made of human skin, and a belt grafted from female nipples. He fashioned masks from faces of corpses and wore them around the house. He created a skin corset, a torso flayed from a woman's body, complete with breasts, and used it as part of his woman's suit. These acts were not macabre, they were ritualistic, and I'll go through a little bit more detail later on. Despite the horror of these acts, Gein did not kill, at least not initially. His crimes were rooted in grave robbery and desecration, but by 1954, that changed. Mary Hogan was born in 1902 in New York and eventually settled in Wisconsin, where she ran a tavern in a small town of Pine Grove, just outside of Plainville. She was known for her independence, her sharp wit, and her resilience. Mary had lived a full life. She'd been married, divorced, and had built a business on her own terms. She was tough, outspoken, and unapologetically herself. On December 8, 1954, Mary disappeared from her tavern. The bar was found empty, with bloodstains on the floor and a spent cartridge from a .22 caliber rifle. Her car was still outside. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear motive, so the case unfortunately went cold. Locals speculated, but few suspected Ed Gein. He was known to frequent Mary's tavern, and he had made offhand comments about her disappearance, once reportedly saying, quote, "She's not missing, she's at the farm right now." People laughed it off. Gein was odd but harmless, or so they thought. It wasn't until 3 years later, after his arrest, that Mary's fate was confirmed. Inside Gein's farmhouse, police found her face preserved in a paper bag and her skull in a box. Gein confessed to shooting her in the head and transporting her body back to his home. He offered no remorse, only a vague explanation. She reminded him of his mother. Mary Hogan was 52 years old when she was murdered. She was more than a victim. She was a woman who had carved out a life in a male-dominated world, who ran her own business and who deserved to be remembered. Ed Gein's second known victim was Bernice Worden. Bernice Worden was born in 1899 and spent most of her life in Plainville. She was the owner of Worden's Hardware Store, a fixture in the community. Widowed and in her late 50s, Bernice was known for a quiet strength and work ethic. She ran the store with her son, Frank Worden, who also served as the town's deputy sheriff. On November 16, 1957, Bernice vanished. It was the first day of deer hunting season, and the town was quiet. Her son arrived at the store to find it empty. The cash register was open, there was blood on the floor, and the last receipt written was for antifreeze, sold to Ed Gein. Frank immediately suspected Gein. He had visited the store the night before and said he'd return in the morning. The police found him later that day at a neighbor's house, casually eating dinner. He was calm, cooperative, almost childlike. When asked about Bernice Worden, he reportedly replied, quote, "She's not missing. She's at the farm." That statement alone was enough. Gein was arrested on suspicion of murder. Officers secured a search warrant and headed to his farmhouse. What they found would redefine the boundaries of criminal horror. Bernice's body was discovered in a shed behind the house. She had been shot with a .22 rifle, decapitated, and hung upside down by her ankles. Her body slit open and dressed like a deer. Her head was found in a burlap sack. Her heart was in a saucepan, and her internal organs removed. Gein admitted to killing her. He said he had stolen a rifle from a neighbor and used it to shoot Bernice in the store. He then loaded her body into the store's truck and drove it back to his farm. The murder was premeditated, methodical, and ritualistic. Bernice Worden was 58 years old. She was a mother, a business owner, and a respected member of her community. Her death shattered the illusion of safety in Plainville and exposed the horrors that had been hiding in plain sight. After discovering Bernice Worden's body hanging in Ed Gein's shed, investigators turned towards the farmhouse. What they found inside wasn't just evidence, it was a descent into a mind unraveling. The house was dark, cold, and cluttered. There was no electricity, no running water, just the smell of decay and the silence of a life lived alone. The kitchen was filthy, dishes stacked high, rotting food, bloodstains, and on the stove something unthinkable, a saucepan containing what appeared to be a human heart. It was later identified as Bernice Worden's, but the horror didn't end there. As officers moved throughout the house, they began to uncover a collection of human remains, crafted, preserved, and displayed. These weren't trophies, they were tools, rituals, attempts at transformation. Among the items catalogued were 4 noses, dried and stored in a box, 9 masks made from human facial skin, some with lipstick applied, 10 female heads, preserved and mounted, their tops sawn off like anatomical specimens, bowls made from skulls, used as everyday containers, a lampshade made of human skin, stretched and stitched, a belt fashioned from nipples, looped like leather, leggings sewn from leg skin, worn like clothing, a corset made from a woman's torso, complete with breasts, a pair of lips used as window shade pulls, Mary Hogan's face found in a paper bag, and her skull in a box beside it. In a shoebox, police found female genitalia preserved and labelled. In another room, a young girl's dress. Investigators speculated it may have been used during Gein's attempts to become his mother. He later admitted to wearing the skin corset and masks, walking around the house in what he called his woman's suit. The house itself was a study in psychological fragmentation. Most rooms were in complete disarray, filthy, chaotic, filled with trash and decay. But one area was pristine, Augusta Gein's bedroom. Ed had boarded it up after her death. Inside, everything remained untouched. It was a shrine. This contrast between the chaos of the living space and the reverence of Augusta's room spoke volumes. Ed Gein wasn't just collecting bodies. He was trying to reconstruct a relationship, to resurrect a presence, and to become someone he had lost. Investigators also found graveyard paraphernalia, shovels, ropes, pry bars. As mentioned earlier, Gein later confessed to robbing graves, targeting recently buried middle-aged women who resembled his mother. He claimed he visited cemeteries in a trance-like state, sometimes digging up bodies and sometimes leaving empty-handed. He admitted to exhuming at least 9 corpses, though the true number is definitely higher. The farmhouse was declared a carnal house, a term used for places filled with death. But it was more than that. It was a psychological mausoleum, a place where grief, obsession, and isolation had taken physical form. Outside, the town of Plainfield reeled. Neighbours had known Ed for years, who had even hired him to babysit their children, who shared meals with them. They were stunned. He had seemed odd, yes, but polite, quiet, and harmless, so no one imagined this. The house was eventually boarded up. Looters tried to steal artifacts. The property was put up for auction, but burned down under suspicious circumstances before it could be sold. Some say it was arson, others say it was mercy, but the memory of what was found inside remains. At the jail, after his arrest, Gein was placed in a holding cell. He didn't ask for a lawyer, he didn't protest, he sat quietly, as if waiting. Sheriff Art Schley, a seasoned officer, took lead in questioning. But what began as a routine interrogation quickly spiraled into something else. Schley later admitted that the details of Gein's crimes were so grotesque, so psychologically disturbing, that he lost control. During questioning, he reportedly slammed Gein's head into a wall, frustrated by his calm demeanour and the horror of his confessions. This act of violence would later be used to challenge the admissibility of Gein's statements in court. Despite the assault, Gein talked. He confessed to killing Bernice Warden, describing how he shot her with a .22 caliber rifle inside the store, loaded her body into the store's truck, and drove her to his farm. There he decapitated her, hung her upside down, and dressed her like a deer, a phrase that investigators would never forget. He also admitted to the 1954 murder of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had vanished under similar circumstances. Her face and skull were later found in Gein's home. He said she reminded him of his mother, but the murders were only part of the story. Gein then described the dozens of nighttime visits to local cemeteries between 1947 and 1952. As mentioned earlier, he claimed he often went in a trance-like state, digging up the recently buried middle-aged woman who resembled his mother, Augusta Gein. Sometimes he took entire bodies, sometimes only parts of bodies. He used these remains to create what he called his woman's suit, a skin corset, mask, and clothing made from human flesh. He said he wore them around the house, sometimes at night, sometimes while imagining himself as his mother. He denied having sex with the bodies, and insisted he was not a cannibal. His tone throughout the questioning was detached, almost clinical. He described his actions with the same calm as someone recounting a recipe. Investigators noted that he seemed unaware of the gravity of his crimes. He didn't cry, he didn't rage, he just simply explained. After his arrest, Gein was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Walpin, Wisconsin. There, he underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, specifically paranoid type, and described as having a mixed personality disorder with obsessive-compulsive, schizoid, and psychopathic traits. He was also labelled a sexual psychopath, though he denied any sexual contact with the bodies, and no evidence of necrophilia was ever confirmed. Some things that psychiatrists noted that Gein exhibited were a flat affect, he spoke in a calm, detached manner even when describing horrific acts, delusional thinking, he believed he could resurrect his mother or become her by wearing the skin of other women, poor reality testing, he struggled to distinguish fantasy from reality, especially in his grave-robbing rituals, extreme emotional dependency. His identity was enmeshed with his mother, Augusta, to the point of psychological fusion. One psychiatrist, Dr. E. Schubert, described Gein as, quote, a man who lived in a dream world, and noted that his crimes were not sadistic in the traditional sense. They were attempts to reconstruct a lost relationship. Central to Gein's psychological profile was his obsessive attachment to his mother. Augusta Gein was domineering, religiously fanatical, and emotionally controlling. She taught Ed that women were sinful and that sexuality was shameful. He internalized these beliefs deeply. After her death in 1945, Gein's mental state deteriorated. He preserved her room as a shrine and began robbing graves of women who resembled her, and later admitting to crafting the woman's suit from human skin, which he wore around the house to sometimes imagine himself as Augusta. This behavior aligns with what psychologists call a pathological grief response. Instead of mourning and moving forward, Gein tried to recreate his mother physically. His crimes were not expressions of hatred, they were expressions of longing. Gein's actions suggest a profound identity disturbance. He lived alone, spoke rarely, and had few social connections. He was described by neighbours as odd but harmless, and often babysat children, an eerie detail given what was later found in his home. Experts also believe that Gein may have experienced dissociative episodes during which he committed grave robberies and murders in a trance-like state. He himself claimed that he sometimes didn't remember the full extent of what he had done. His creation of masks, skin suits, and preserved body parts was interpreted as an attempt to construct an alternative self, one that could embody his mother, or at least feel close to her again. Psychiatrists and criminologists have long debated Gein's case. He wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He committed only 2 confirmed murders. He wasn't driven by sexual gratification, nor did he seek power or control over his victims. Instead, his crimes were ritualistic, symbolic, and rooted in psychological trauma. He was a man who couldn't let go of the past, and who tried to stitch it back together, literally. So then the spectacle began. The farmhouse had been searched, Bernice Warden's body had been found, Ed Gein was in custody, but before the town of Plainfield could begin to process what had happened, the rest of the country was already watching. The story broke fast, and it broke big. Reporters descended on Plainfield within hours. Headlines screamed of skin masks, grave robberies, and a house of horrors. The press didn't just report the facts, they amplified them. Details were repeated, distorted, and embellished. The more grotesque the image, the more ink it got. Photographs of the farmhouse circulated widely. Though many were censored, descriptions of the interior, bowls made from human skulls, a belt of nipples, a lampshade of human skin, became part of the public imagination. The media dubbed Gein as things like the Mad Butcher, the Ghoul of Plainfield, and America's real-life monster. But in the rush to publish, something was lost. The victims, Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, were reduced to names. Their lives, their histories, and their families were overshadowed by the spectacle. The focus shifted from who they were to what was done to them, and Ed Gein, once a quiet handyman, became a cultural icon of horror. The coverage wasn't just local. National outlets picked up the story. Magazines ran features. Radio shows speculated on his motives. Even pulp horror comics referenced the case. The line between journalism and entertainment blurred, and then came Hollywood. In 1959, author Robert Bloch, who lived just 50 miles from Plainfield, published Psycho. Though he claimed the novel was only loosely inspired by Gein, the parallels were clear: a reclusive man with a dead mother, a hidden double life, and a house full of secrets. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film adaptation cemented the connection. Norman Bates became the first of many Gein-inspired characters. In 1974, Tobe Hooper released The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Leatherface, with his skin mask and raw isolation, was a direct homage. Later, The Silence of the Lambs introduced Buffalo Bill, another killer who used human skin to transform himself. Each of these characters borrowed from Gein's pathology, but none told the full story. And in 2025, nearly 70 years after Ed Gein's arrest, his story returned to the spotlight, this time through the lens of streaming television. Monster, the Ed Gein story, the third season in Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan's true crime anthology, debuted on Netflix to massive attention. Starring Charlie Hunnam as Gein and Laurie Metcalf as Augusta Gein. The series promised to explore the origins, crimes, and cultural aftermath of one of America's most infamous murderers. They turned trauma into entertainment. While these films and TV shaped the horror genre, they also shaped public memory. Ed Gein became a symbol, a shorthand for madness, depravity, and fear. But the real story was more complex. It wasn't about chainsaws or cannibalism. It wasn't about grief, isolation, and a fractured identity. It was about 2 women who were murdered, and many more who were desecrated. The media frenzy also affected Plainville. Residents were harassed, photographed, and interviewed. Some were offered money for stories. Others were mocked. The town became synonymous with horror, and many locals refused to speak of Gein for decades. Even the legal proceedings were overshadowed. In 1957, Gein was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial. He was institutionalized for over a decade before being deemed competent in 1968. He was then tried for the murder of Bernice Worden and found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent the rest of his life at Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he reportedly lived quietly, reading, gardening, and attending therapy. He died in 1984 at age 77. We've spent this episode tracing the life and crimes of Ed Gein, from the quiet farmhouse to the graveyards, the murders, the media frenzy, and the psychological unraveling. But now we step back, because this story isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember. For decades, Gein has been mythologized. His crimes inspired Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lamb, and now Netflix's Monster, The Ed Gein Story. He's become a symbol, a shorthand for horror, madness, and depravity. But symbols are easy, people are harder. And the people in this story deserve more. Mary Hogan was a tavern owner, independent, sharp-witted. She built a life on her own terms in a town that didn't always welcome outsiders. She was murdered in 1954, and her disappearance was treated like a mystery until her face was found in a paper bag. Bernice Worden was a mother, a business owner, and a respected member of her community. She ran Warden's hardware store with her son, Deputy Frank Worden. She was murdered in 1957, and her body was desecrated in ways that defy comprehension. These women were not props in a horror story. They were real, and their lives were interrupted, not just by violence, but by the way their stories were told. And not to mention just the countless amount of women's bodies who were taken from their graves and desecrated, worn like skin, used as furniture. The media focused on Gein, the artifacts, the grotesque, the spectacle. Hollywood turned him into a monster, and the victims became background. Even now, in the age of streaming true crime, their names are often buried beneath the headlines. But we can choose differently. We can tell their stories with dignity. And we can ask what it means when trauma becomes entertainment. Because true crime isn't just about what was done. It's about who it was done to and how we remember them. This is Criminal Interrupted. Thank you for listening.